It's Monday, March 31st. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast, and it is a hell of a day to talk ball. And joining me to do just that is Chris Trapasso of CBS Sports. Chris, you and I got to meet for the first time. We've known each other for like forever. I mean, like a decade plus at this point, but we met in real life for the first time at the NFL Scouting Combine. And I think this actually might be the first time we've done a podcast together. So I'm very excited to have you today. What's going on, buddy?
Yeah, it felt like impossible that at the 2025 Combine was the first time that we met, because we were tweeting about players in the 2011 and 2012 draft on Twitter together. And the fact that this is the first time that we've done any like form of content together is really mind-blowing to me. But I will keep it short, because anything I say cannot sufficiently articulate how excited I am to talk about a mock draft, and more specifically about prospects in this draft with you today on this podcast.
Man, I'm excited too. Not just that we finally are doing a show together, but just to continue to break down this draft class in general, Chris, because it's a super fascinating group of players to talk about, really at the top, but all throughout. And I feel like we're just a little less now than a month away from the draft. And I feel like I'm still just kind of trying to get my bearings on this group as a whole. So very excited to get your perspective on the players we're going to talk through today. If you're new to Mock Draft Monday, if you're coming over here because you're one of the diehard Chris fans out there, and obviously there are swarms of them that have come to the podcast here to check this out because of that, Chris, because you're a heavy hitter. If you're new to the show, Mock Draft Monday, what we do here on our show, mock drafts, you love them, you hate them. They are a part of draft season. So we try to get the best in the business of the folks that are analyzing all the prospects that are doing mock drafts and have them give us 5 of their favorite player to team fits from their most recent mock draft, because Chris knows this. Anybody that does mock drafts knows this. Sometimes you don't love all 32 if you're just doing a first round mock. You don't love all 32 picks you make, but you got to make them all. But there are a few that stick with you and you made them for a specific reason. So that's what we're going to break down here today on the show. And at the end of the pod, as we do on all of our draft series, Chris is going to give us the prospect that he is willing to stand on the table for. So let's jump right into it. Chris, let's get your first favorite player to team fit from your most recent mock draft.
Okay, so we're going to start with the caveat that I have done a mock draft once a week since the start of the football season. So there's been about every possible combination that you could go through. I probably had it in a mock. So when I get like 10 of 32 right, I can just point to my October 28th mock and say, look, hey, I almost had this first round, a third of it right. So
wait a second. I gotta dig into this. So wait a second. I mean, like, I was giving Charles and Nate, obviously our guys here at Yahoo Sports, Nate Tice, Charles McConnell, I was giving them grief for having done like mock 6.0 by the time we got to the combine. So bro, you're like on what, mock 69.0 by the time we get to the combine?
I was at mock 6.0 by like Halloween.
Oh
so
my God.
They have
And
I'll say,
I don't know what you're getting paid, Chris, but you need to ask for more money.
That's. I mean, okay, let's just clip that out and put that on social media. We'll send it to the CBS. We'll just add CBS Sports at the bottom. But I'll start in which, now that we've gotten out of the way that I've done far too many mock drafts leading up until this point. The first player that I'm going to go with that I love the fit, and this is coming from someone that literally owns a T-shirt that my wife's Etsy store made for me, that says, do not draft running backs in the first round. But I'm going to go Ashton Jeanty, Las Vegas Raiders, number 6 overall. In a vacuum as an evaluator, because of that, what I just mentioned about that I am one of those advocates to wait on the running back position, especially in this class. I think now this Raiders team, Geno Smith, Chip Kelly, Pete Carroll, Tom Brady calling the shots. Yes, they need some other pieces, but I think the defense is going to be better because of Carroll. They have Christian Wilkins coming back, Max Crosby. What they need is more explosiveness on offense. They only had 30 runs of more than 10 yards last season. That was the second lowest total in the NFL. And weirdly, the Chiefs were actually the only team lower. I think Isaiah Pacheco being out was probably a big factor in that. Ashton Jeanty's film is just loaded with 30, 40, 50, 60-yard runs. He had the most in college football last season, 63 of those runs of 10 or more yards. Now, some of that was due to the fact that he had like 350 carries, but he looks like a low 4.4 guy on film. His contact balance is the best that I have ever scouted. and he can really go down the field. So I think suddenly with Jacoby Myers, with Trey Tucker, Geno Smith, and then you throw Ashton Jeanty in there, not looking at anything about positional value and where you could get better value at that position. I just love that fit for a team that has an absolute massive hole at the feature back spot to get the best running back in this class.
The Raiders had a historically bad run game last year.
Really bad.
Man, their run game was so bad that at a moment at the end of the year when like Sincere McCormick had a couple of good runs in a game. We had Andy Behrens on this show being like, Sincere McCormick might make like a decent little fantasy starter, because that's how thirsty people were for something from the Raiders backfield. 32nd in rushing success rate, 32nd in EPA per rush. And by the way, they were 32nd in EPA per rush by a decent gap. It was them and the Texans that were below. They were the only teams below 35% rushing success rate, but it was the Raiders and the Dolphins dead last in rushing EPA. And again, there was a healthy gap between them and like the 30th ranked team. Yeah, I mean, so the Patriots actually were 30th. They didn't really do anything very well last year, so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it was just a disaster of a run game. And I mean, listen, you hire Pete Carroll, you bring in Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator. Chris, they're screaming to us that they want to run the ball. So, this has become a very popular pick in a lot of mocks lately, but it makes a lot of sense. Charles and I were just talking about it last week on the running back preview show about why this potential landing spot makes sense. I want you to, tell the people just out there, first and foremost, from like an Ashton Jeanty perspective, because you said like you're not a big fan of drafting running backs in the first round, but if we were to stack Jeanty with kind of like the running backs who have gone high in recent drafts, I'm thinking, Bijan Robinson 8th overall, obviously back to like Saquon Barkley 2nd overall in 2018. Where does he stack up historically among these like top 10 drafted running backs?
He's below Saquon Barkley in terms of his overall elusiveness, and I think some of the numbers would bear that out. But like I said earlier, I think in terms of contact balance, it is the best that I've ever scouted. And he's a little shorter. He's like 5'9", but over 200 pounds that, he meets that threshold, and he can really run downfield. He's going to be able to be that home run hitter. He's not Chris Johnson fast, but again, I think had he tested, we would have seen something in the low 4.4s, would not have surprised me whatsoever. So he's not quite as complete of a back as Saquon Barkley. I don't think he's as versatile as Christian McCaffrey, who's another one that was a top 10 pick. I think he's better than Leonard Fournette was in terms of just what he gives and can get more than what is blocked. There are so many runs where you're sure he's going to go down like 3 different times. And it's not like he's running through people. He just absorbs contact and can stay with an unshaken equilibrium better than any running back that I've ever seen. So I don't advocate picking running backs that early, but I think he certainly belongs. And if you plugged him into any other of these really highly touted draft classes over the last 5 to 10 years, he would be still a first-round caliber prospect.
And from like a system fit perspective, obviously you watched a lot of Ohio State last year. There's 2 great running backs in this year's class from Ohio State. What do we expect like Chip Kelly to run from a system perspective, and how does Jeanty fit into that mix? Because I think that's the key in like really getting all the juice out of the squeeze of a running back that you're taking 6th overall here.
Yeah, and then so for me to say that Jeanty, if there is a weakness, it's that he's not crazy elusive. I think from watching Ohio State and just we've seen Chip Kelly everywhere the last 15 years in the NFL and college. I want to see Ashton Jeanty with more of a runway out of the shotgun. At Boise State, a lot of it was like I formation, classic football, following a lead blocker. I want to see him be able to get the ball to the outside where we can see how fast he truly is, where he can hit those jets early on in the running play and then extend it and really open up down the field. So I think a lot more usage out of the shotgun on RPOs where we have a lot of defenders that are kind of stationary and aren't really sure what's going to ultimately happen, where the ball's going to go, could lead to those runways where we don't have to have Ashton Jeanty, deploy one of those, say, LaShawn McCoy jump cuts to make someone miss. He can get that, full head of steam as he's getting to the second level. Yeah.
And listen, this was on my radar a lot with the Seahawks last year, that I thought their running backs, Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, but especially Kenneth Walker, it was more of a straight up under center back. which is going to be great for the offense that they're installing now under Clint Kubiak. I think Kenneth Walker obviously is in line for a pretty nice season if he can stay healthy, but like he was a better fit in that sort of offense, whereas Geno Smith is, I think Geno can do under center, traditional NFL stuff, but he was great as a passer out of the gun. So I think like if they're going to do more gun stuff with Geno Smith, this lines up really well with what you're wanting to see out of Ashton Jeanty. Love that. Really good. And I mean, I'm just looking at like early fantasy rankings. It's obviously way too early for this stuff, but like let's live in a hypothetical world that Ashton Jeanty is the 6th overall pick by the Las Vegas Raiders. We know they want to run the piss out of the ball. We like the system fit with him and Geno Smith and some of the run game concepts they're going to install there. Like Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Derrick Henry. That's kind of your first tier of backs. But I'm looking at just like early, again, Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, like tier 2 in their running back rankings, like Devon Achane, Bucky Irving, Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor. Like I bet that Jeanty will find his way into that mix if he is a Raider. I mean, shoot, I would Bucky Irving, maybe I don't know if I'd go there, but like Jacobs, Taylor, definitely over Achane. I'm not going to be ranking Devon Achane 5th overall running back next year. I'll tell you that. I think Jeanty makes his way into that group there, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
And one other thing too, we didn't see a lot in 24 of Ashton Jeanty catching the football. And we know, like, when I think back to Chip Kelly, I think back to the Oregon days and how diverse that screen package was for all of his running backs that he had at Oregon, even like the LaMichael James types, the guys that in college were really good, but didn't really have NFL caliber, explosiveness or speed or elusiveness. So I want to see how much of a ceiling Ashton Jeanty has as a dual threat guy, because we saw him catch passes throughout his career at Boise State, but it was, like you said, more under center. It was more of a traditional running scheme. He got the ball so often, almost 350 carries last season, that there just wasn't enough of a workload for him to get to catch passes. So I think with Kelly, you would probably presume that if they pick him at 6 overall, he's going to be a featured part of the underneath passing game as well, where again, his vision, one cut and go speed will be really accentuated.
Yeah, I like that a lot. They have a bevy of short area passing game options between Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, and then Ashton Jeanty into the mix. We need somebody to stretch that defense out a little bit.
Yeah.
we need like a sacrificial X receiver bare minimum in this Raiders offense, but they can do that later on in the draft after they've taken Jeanty at the 6th overall pick. I dig this pick a lot. It's a great way to get it started. All the Dynasty bros are very excited, Chris, to take Ashton Jeanty, Las Vegas Raiders running back, at their 1st overall pick in their Dynasty rookie drafts. Let's get to your second favorite fit from your most recent mock.
All right. So this one, I said I've done like 8,000 mock drafts. I have not mocked this. I don't know any other time besides this mock. So you're getting a little treat here.
I like it.
Tet McMillan to the Dallas Cowboys at 12. And here's the reason why. And I have a bunch of them. Last season, the wide receiver in Dallas who played the most snaps on the outside was Jalen Tolbert. 436, I think it was. 436 snaps on the outside. That led to CeeDee Lamb playing almost half of his snaps on the outside. And we know that CeeDee Lamb is better and wants to play in the slot, where we saw him as an all-pro in 2023. That's predominantly where he aligned, in the slot. Also, who played outside, Brandon Cooks and Jalen Brooks. They were number 3 and number 4 in terms of outside receiver snaps. You mentioned with the Raiders, they need a sacrificial X. I think the Cowboys just need an X receiver so badly, and that is precisely what Tet McMillan is. 6'4", 220 pounds. He played 75% of his snaps at Arizona on the outside. And instead of me listing off every single one of his attributes, I think he is somewhere in the range of T. Higgins to Drake London. He's a good contested catch receiver. He's not Mike Evans, but he's going to be able to rebound and box out. He's not going to get open a ton, but he's really good after the catch because he's just a moose. He's big. He wants to create in those situations. So I think it would prolong Dak Prescott's prime, if you want to think that he's still in there, and directly impact CeeDee Lamb to play on the inside a lot more, where he's so dynamic in the slot. Tet McMillan, if he's there at 12, I think this would be a splash pick that Jerry Jones would want to make, and it would actually be pretty logical too.
I think this is a great pick as well. I think Tet McMillan actually might be our most popular mock draft Monday like pick so far from folks. But I think this is the first time he's gone to Dallas. I'm pretty sure he's gone to the Raiders. I think Trevor Sikkema sent him to the Patriots. So people want to see Tet McMillan in a good landing spot, but I think this one might sneakily be perfect for a couple of reasons here, Chris. As you mentioned, classic X receiver is Tet McMillan, 80th percentile success rate versus press coverage and reception perception. I think he can get off the line of scrimmage pretty well, especially in that intermediate area. I think he doesn't necessarily, like, the separation concerns for me are really only in two areas. I don't think he takes the top off well in terms of like go routes and things like that. Now, he can be a big play asset for you, and I think teams will respect him as a big play asset because he's not like I don't think he's got like a trump card trait, to use one of my old phrases, like a trump card trait as like a contested catch ball winner down the field, but he's clearly good at that, right? Like that is where he will make some deep plays for you. The other area where the separation concerns are an issue is like in the quick game. I think like just on slants and stuff like that. Well, who cares? In Dallas, you're throwing a slant, that thing's going to number 88. That's going to CeeDee Lamb. So I think he can really eat in that intermediate area as the X receiver. But the area, Chris, that this really crystallizes to me as a good fit is that I actually think Tet McMillan, while he is a true X, I think he could be really maximized in ways that like the Colts have maximized Michael Pittman, who also has a pretty similar build as Tet McMillan does as T-Mac, but they use him off the line of scrimmage on like in breakers and crossers and digs and things like that. And I think because CeeDee Lamb is a guy that you can also line up at X, you maximize him by lining him up in the slot, but you can line him up at X. These two guys can actually help each other be maximized by taking some reps at that X position and allowing some flexibility in the wide receiver room that, I mean, guys like Jalen Tolbert and Brandon Cooks and these fellas were not doing for Lamb previously.
Yeah, and that's really it. I think just looking at the Cowboys roster, it's like it's a roster that needs help on the offensive side, and that is the most glaring need. I've sent Ashton Jeanty to them a bunch, but I think they could wait in this really deep running back class. And as you get further down, there's plenty of wide receivers who are really good. I mean, we've seen second, third, fourth, fifth round, you can still get quality players. Same is true with running back. But to get what you're mentioning, that classic X, you kind of find that there aren't too many of those types, especially a big body like Tet McMillan. Now, you don't need to be 6'4", 220. We all know that to play X in the NFL, but he's one where I just feel like he would kind of stick out like as this is the best player available in a clear need position who impacts your two of your highest paid players in Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb.
Right. Like that's the thing. This is going to become a very top heavy roster in terms of the salary. Like they weren't winning games with CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons and Dak Prescott, and now they're going to have to try to win games by paying those guys a lot more money than they were a few years ago. So how do we get the most out of them? Let's try to find a way to do that with our first pick. They absolutely do that in this scenario here with T-Mac at the 12th overall selection. This is kind of, look, I don't want good things for producer Colin, who is a Cowboys fan and has been lighting up the chat as we've been talking about this. I famously do not want the good things for the Dallas Cowboys because of that, but I actually think this is a great landing spot for T-Mac, and I will be willing to sacrifice here and allow the Cowboys fans to feel something, at least for a few moments in the close of April before their dreams are inevitably smashed again in the regular season. Before we go down too many Cowboys, sadness routes, let's get to your third favorite fit from your most recent mock draft.
All right, I'm going to go one pick later, number 13 overall, Miami Dolphins. I'm going with Walter Nolen, the defensive tackle from Ole Miss. Now, when we think Miami Dolphins, we think Mike McDaniel and Tyreek Hill and Tua and speed and Devon Achane and explosiveness. The defense needs help. I mean, I'm up in Buffalo. I've watched the Bills and Josh Allen just do whatever they want offensively against this Dolphins defense the last 5 or 6 years, and they've had some top-heavy talent on the roster. It's the depth that they just have not had, especially up front. The Dolphins haven't picked an interior defensive lineman since the second round of the 2020 draft. And that guy was Raekwon Davis, who at Alabama was just a big body, was not an upfield pass rusher, and was more of just a block eater, two-gapper. With Walter Nolen, they would get someone that can actually be a 40, 50, 60 pressure a season guy at defensive tackle. I think last year they really missed not having Christian Wilkins next to Zach Seiler on that defensive line. And ironically, my comparison for Walter Nolen is Zach Seiler. They're like both 6'4", 300-ish pounds, get up the field, high motors, pass rush moves are pretty defined and pretty diverse for being such a young player. Can play him really anywhere. I don't think he has to just be a 3 technique. And he's just someone that I think would be different from the Dolphins and would kind of be a reminder that you have to generate pass rush on the inside. It can't just be all about Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, who have not been able to stay healthy, and then Chop Robinson, who really broke out down the stretch, their first round pick on the edge last year. You need some more, not even just beef on the inside. You need explosive players. And to me, in terms of just pure explosion in this loaded defensive tackle class, Walter Nolen has the most electricity up the field. So a stray away from offense for the Dolphins, address a position that they really just have not addressed early in the draft in the last 4 drafts.
Yeah, they have plenty of picks later to burn on another fast running back. Like, don't worry, one more fast running back in this offense will all come together. So, I like this pick from Walter Nolen perspective because, one, I think Walter Nolen's a good prospect, man. Like, he can really maybe be like the replacement for Christian Wilkins that they clearly missed last year. When they said the front office, I think Chris Greer and the guys said, hey, Christian Wilkins has earned the right to test free agency. Whenever a player says that, they're like, or when a team says that about a player, like, we really don't want to lose this guy, but we can't afford to franchise tag and we can't afford to pay him. So the Dolphins have actually been one of the few teams that have truly been restricted by the salary cap the last couple of years, even as the cap has exploded. So they need someone to kind of replace what Christian Wilkins was for them. They need someone to work off of Chop Robinson, because I'm glad you brought his name up, man. Chop Robinson, to me, like watching the Dolphins defense down the stretch, which had its moments, I think is well structured. They just need some more premium talent. I think Chop Robinson really impressed down the stretch last year, and having him work in tandem as a pass rusher with Walter Nolen could be something that gets the best out of both guys.
And yeah, last season, Calais Campbell was so good for them at like 38 years old. He's currently a free agent. They could re-sign him. Like he's a South Florida guy, but as of right now, like as of us recording this, Calais Campbell is a free agent. And they had Benito Jones and Deshaun Hand playing snaps at defensive tackle last season. It's been a patchwork unit on the inside. And again, within their own division, they play the Bills and Josh Allen's never touched, and he goes for 350 with 4 touchdowns and has like 60 yards rushing. So if they want to try to even close the gap against the Bills at all, I think being able to generate pressure from the inside and push the pocket against Josh Allen, or even in the AFC against Burrow and Mahomes and Herbert and the likes of all the quality quarterbacks, CJ Stroud as well, maybe even Drake May in with the Patriots, is going to be a problem soon. So I think that's just someone where Walter Nolen is maybe not a name that you see a lot get mocked to the Dolphins, but it is a clear need for this team to just be a little bit more formidable with its pass rush on the inside.
Yeah, and if you can't tell with how I'm talking about the Dolphins, one, I'm kind of skeptical of the whole, like, just the whole operation right now at this point, and like the future of the kind of brain trust there and just the direction of the team generally. But also, like, they kind of need to have a mature eat your vegetables type of draft here, like I liked the Chop Robinson pick a lot last year and he came on well. Like, let's continue to build in the trenches, right? Like, let's continue to build up our pass rush. And certainly at some point in this draft, Chris, if they take Walter Nolen 13th overall, let's get some offensive linemen in the mix here. They signed James Daniels, a free agent. James Daniels is a nice player who's come off a torn Achilles, So I want to see the Dolphins show a little maturity as a team building kind of operation.
Maturity, that's a good word.
Yeah, maturity. And like, let's eat your vegetables, build up the trenches, because I am a little skeptical that this, just in where this regime is going right now, where this team is heading directionally, but they want to be an offensive first team. And we know this, if you're going to be an offensive first team, you need guys to rush the passer to close out games. Hopefully Nolen, Chris, can be a part of that here. So I like this pick a lot as well.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like, everything that you just said about maturing as an organization from the team building perspective, doesn't it kind of feel like they've already like hit their max of how good they can be given this current makeup, like what they've tried to do with Tua, the timing based pass game, Tyreek Hill's getting up there in age. We've seen, maybe we could see a little more from Jalen Waddle, but he's been explosive at times. Jonnu Smith played well. It kind of feels like, and again, I think I have kind of a unique perspective, watching a lot of Dolphins over the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of their games, it feels like, all right, we've seen Tua like lead the league in quarterback rating, lead the league in passing yards, and then they get trounced in the first round of the playoffs in what is a very loaded AFC. So I think everything that you just said makes perfect sense. they have to kind of switch up the philosophy with their team building a little. You still keep the guys from the previous philosophy, with Tua and Tyreek and Jalen Waddle and Chop Robinson, but they have to go in a different direction from the more flash and the glitz and glamour of drafting, a lot of speed and guys being undersized. They need better play on both sides in the trenches.
Yeah, well, don't worry. They signed Zach Wilson this offseason, so if Tua misses any more time, they've got their solution at backup quarterback. So we at least can hang our hat on that. All right, let's take our first break. When we come back, we'll get some more of Chris's favorite fits from his most recent mock draft right after this. All right, we're back. Chris, let's keep marching forward here. Give me your fourth favorite fit here.
Okay, number 27 overall, Baltimore Ravens, Derrick Harmon, the defensive tackle from Oregon. Now, I know that this feels like a little bit late for him, but certainly way crazier things have happened in the draft. When I think of the Baltimore Ravens and going from Ozzie Newsome as the GM to Eric DeCosta and the entire John Harbaugh era, when I think defense and I think defensive line, we're past the Ray Lewis, Ed Reed era at this point. I still think big, oversized defensive linemen, kind of that classic 3-4 look, but not that teams are necessarily playing that as much. And with Derrick Harmon, 6'5", 310 pounds, he looks like that classic 3-4 defensive end, but he gets up the field. His pass rush win rate, the pressure rate at Oregon was really good last season. He's not like the most dynamic upfield athlete, but his pass rush move arsenal is very well developed. He has a pretty good first step. The power conversion is there. And just thinking of guys like Nnamdi Madubuike and Paul Kruger and Matt Judon and Zadarius Smith. Now, some of those guys are edge players. They're all 275. They were bigger as most edge rushers were. A lot of the guys, Brandon Williams, Madubuike, big, wide-bodied players. That's kind of how I feel about Derrick Harmon, that you could literally play him anywhere along the defensive line. And really, their defensive coordinator, Zach Orr, played with a lot of those guys up front and understands the importance of having just big, hulking defensive linemen that one snap, they're on the outside shoulder of the offensive tackle. The next snap, they're on the nose of the football. That's how I view Derrick Harmon as a prospect and where I think he could be completely maximized in the NFL, and no better landing spot for him, in my opinion, than in Baltimore with the Ravens.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're sitting here saying, "Oh, maybe this is a little later. This guy won't fall this far." The Ravens always do this. They just take whoever is the best consensus player that's falling too far. Let's
Linderbaum,
stop overthinking
Kyle
it.
Hamilton.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Every single time. I mean, shoot, Lamar Jackson, maybe the best example of all. This guy should not be here at the 32nd overall pick. Let's go ahead and we've taken an old tight end with our first round pick. Let's get another one here and bring in Lamar Jackson. So makes sense. The Ravens love to do this. Also, kind of going underreported, or at least under-discussed, that Michael Pierce, their longtime nose tackle, retired in March, early March, right around when free agency opened. Obviously, yeah, nobody's lighting up the news headlines with Michael Pierce's retirement in the middle of free agency, but he was their 345-pound nose tackle. Maybe Derrick Harmon's not that guy necessarily, but if you're saying he's a player that could play all over, they need help on that interior. This certainly feels like an area that they can address early in the draft.
And outside of Madubuike, I feel like they have needed another upfield pass rusher. We just talked about it with the Dolphins, that they've gotten decent contributions on the edge from Odafe Owe, but that's the one area for this Ravens team that, to me, they're perpetually good. They're always in the race. They're always one of the top teams in the AFC. From ownership down, it's just been one of the most well-run organizations in football, since they've been in Baltimore, essentially. But lately, it feels like the defensive line hasn't had that same vintage Baltimore Ravens type impact on every game. And to go from Michael Pierce, who was, of course, very good for them in a very niche role, but was mostly just a run stuffer, two-gapper, wasn't really getting up the field, and maybe replacing that with someone that's 6'5", 310, 315, that next to Madubuike can also provide some juice. That's what really intrigued Derrick Harmon for me to send him to Baltimore, because I think Eric DeCosta might be, in that market to add a little bit more juice to the defensive line, again, in an AFC that is loaded with elite level quarterbacks.
Right, talking about the AFC and these elite level quarterbacks, it's kind of hard to put your finger on why the Ravens have maybe fallen short in big games. It does feel like there's some sort of ineffable like tightness that they play with when they get into these games.
Yep.
And sometimes it's hard to like until you get the monkey off your back, sometimes it's hard to not feel that weight. And I feel like the Ravens do play in the postseason as if they feel that weight. The other thing that could help them a lot is like, hey, if we get a lead in one of these games, let's get some closers here. And I think to your point that, they haven't necessarily had that game ending presence. And I'm curious to hear if you think Derrick Harmon could be that type of like game ending, obviously I'm not saying he's gonna be the next Chris Jones, but like what Chris Jones has done for the Chiefs as an interior rusher, like, all right, time to win the Super Bowl, time to win the AFC Championship game. Let's end the game. Chris Jones goes and does it. I would say the Ravens have had a lot of good players. They've specialized in like, let's find the old value edge rusher every single year, whether it's like Justin Houston
Clowney.
or Kyle Van Noy. Yeah, Clowney at one point. Like they always have that guy, but someone that's young and athletic and can truly end games for them in big contests. That I would say is like their biggest need right now as a team.
Yeah, I don't think he's quite Chris Jones, but the measurables are pretty close. And I think the film is not like, it's not an apples to oranges comparison, that he's long. He wins with his hands. I saw him win again at 5 technique, at 3 technique, and on the football. And we know that throughout his career, as he's really become the best defensive tackle in football, Chris Jones like wins around the corner like an edge rusher. Yeah. It's pretty insane. So it's like to compare someone to that is tough. But Chris Jones was like 6'6", 310 coming out of Mississippi State and was a second rounder. And because of his pass rush move arsenal and the fluidity that he moved getting upfield, that is really what sparked him to become the player that he is today. There's a glimmer of that with Derrick Harmon. So I don't know if he can be a Chris Jones level closer, but it wouldn't shock me given, look at his pass rush win rate, his pressure rate at Oregon time and time again, and a great run defender too. So he feels like you're mentioning that the Ravens have had those good players. He feels almost like a step up where he can be, by year 2, be a great player and then maybe continue to ascend as he continues to develop in that organization in Baltimore.
I love it. All right, give me your 5th favorite player to team fit here.
Okay, so this is coming from a mock draft trade. Now we're getting close to the draft, so I do include trades in my mock. And again, the redundancy of doing a mock draft every week, if you just don't have any trades, it can get like you're just staring at paint, you're just watching paint dry. This is number 30 overall, which is the original Bills pick. I have the Bills trading up for Nick Manwari, the safety, but it's not that. It's what the Vikings get back at 30. Gray Zabel, the North Dakota State offensive tackle, but in this situation in Minnesota, he's going to play guard. And I think the one concern that I have with him and why universally, just looking at the draft as a whole, not, again, factoring in team fit, I have a little bit of a lower grade on Zabel because he's not particularly powerful. That even in the, FBS level, you see times where it takes him a second to kind of reset his anchor or to drive defenders out of the way. But the mobility, the explosiveness, climbs to the second level. I just think he was born to play in a Kyle Shanahan, or in this case, Kevin O'Connell scheme, to block on an outside zone play. And what I think would be really good about this fit is if you're going to be someone that needs to get stronger, or to use a scouting term that I love, get more sand in your pants, play next to Christian Darrisaw at left tackle and Ryan Kelly at center, who they brought in free agency. That would probably mitigate any of the power deficiency that you're going to see with Gray Zabel. And I think in time, he could almost be the Brian O'Neill of guards in Minnesota. That we both remember watching Brian O'Neill at the University of Pittsburgh, and it was like, wow, what a crazy athlete. But he just looks like a tight end out there. He's not strong enough yet. He's become a really high caliber right tackle because in time, in almost every case, you can gain strength and power in an NFL strength and conditioning program. So after trading back, they only have 4 picks to start. Get some extra picks. Get your left guard of the future to really build what I think would be one of the best offensive lines in football if the Vikings could draft Gray Zabel in the first round.
I'm so glad that this is one of the picks that you made here because I'm like obsessed with what the Vikings are doing on the interior offensive line, man, because, it started out last year that was a very explosive and really efficient run game. in Minnesota. Like, I remember talking about it with Nate on one of the fantasy film rooms. Like, man, this run game looks like it could be pretty interesting, but it petered off towards the end of the year for two reasons. One, Aaron Jones was their only like competent back, and he's the guy that you, at this point in his career, you need to spell. He can't be just your pure number one back, and he's going to wear down because of age and injuries and things like that. Well, they bring in Jordan Mason this year. I think that's a nice compliment.
Love him.
And they could still add somebody in the draft too, but I think they add Jordan Mason just like, hey, he's a system fit, as you're mentioning, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Kevin O'Connell, the whole coaching tree that we know and love. So that's number one. They bring in the compliment there. Number two is that the talent on the interior offensive line, I think just when they faced better teams, that run game obviously was a problem for Sam Darnold and pass protection. It was also a problem in the run game. Well, you add Will Fries, you add Ryan Kelly, you add Gray Zabel here. Last year, Minnesota was 12th in percentage of zone runs according to Fantasy Points data, but they were 23rd in success rate. Like, no doubt about it, as much as they're probably trying to onboard JJ McCarthy and get the passing game up to snuff, they want that run game to be better. So adding Gray Zabel here could be a big part of like pushing that agenda forward.
And I mean, to not continue about this pick, Jordan Mason, I think, is bound. I mean, you would know more than I would about his fantasy value with Aaron Jones there. Maybe it's kind of a crowded backfield, but I think he could be in for a gigantic season because had he not gotten injured when he was spelling Christian McCaffrey, wasn't he like leading the NFL in rushing at the time? Yep. I've always been a huge fan of his since his days at Georgia Tech. The missed tackle force rate through the roof. He's big. I think his vision is really good and just a very seamless scheme fit. There's not any difference in terms of the blocking that he's going to be seeing in Minnesota. And I think that is a clear need. They have Blake Brendel as their other guard at this, or as their other offensive line. That the rest of the group is really good. So to have him replaced with a high caliber athlete who's only going to get bigger and stronger, the rest of his game feels like the perfect small school tackle into left guard. Let him win on inside zone, outside zone, climb to the second level to spring those big holes for Aaron Jones and then ultimately Jordan Mason.
Yeah, just again, to reference Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, Aaron Jones running back 21, Jordan Mason running back 43. I feel like there are scenarios this year where that gap could actually be a little bit closer between those two players. Last question on Zabel, because I've seen, some talk about him potentially actually being a possible center, which it could just be because there's not a great, like, teams are looking at last year's class. Like, look at what Cooper Beebe did with the Cowboys. Look what Graham Barton did with the Bucks. And like, we got to get our own Graham Barton. Well, teams are looking around and not seeing a lot of Graham Bartons in this particular draft class. So maybe Zabel could be a guy who moves into center. Could that actually be an added benefit of this selection here, Chris? Because they signed Ryan Kelly, and I like that. He gives them a lot of size at center, but he's 32 years old, and he's potentially talked about retiring previously. He's not a long-term solution. Could this be one of those moves where they take Zabel, they start him at guard, and then they kick him to center maybe in year 3, year 4?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I actually compare Gray Zabel to Graham Barton. Like, he's my comp for him. I wrote in my scouting report, like, probably not a tackle, not long enough, and I don't necessarily want him dealing with speed to power conversion from some of these big edge rushers. But yes, having that versatility, again, me writing that probably a guard, maybe even a center. He's a little tall for the center position that usually you want him to be like below 6'4" really at the max. And I believe he was over 6'5" at the combine. But yes, having that versatility for a team like the Vikings, that's maybe a little bit of a cherry on top, that insurance policy where, hey, maybe in 26, you are starting center, you've added some weight, you've learned the system, and they feel like it's an upgrade over Garrett Bradbury, who was that move, agile center, just was never long enough and never strong enough to deal with some of the beasts that there are at defensive tackle in today's NFL.
Love it. All right, that turns out to be a pretty good pick here. We're going to take our final break, and then we come back. We're going to get the prospect that Chris is going to stand on the table for in this year's draft right after this. All right, it is time for Stand on the Table.
Well, Captain, my captain.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson.
We have Bill's Mafia here.
Let's go! AJ to the table!
All right, Chris, in this segment, we just get you, the draft expert, to tell us the prospect that you are willing to stand on the table for, your guy in this year's draft class. Hit me with a name here.
All right, so wait, I have a question first. Is this the next level up from banging on the table? This would mean, like, if I'm in a draft room working for a team, you bang on the table, you really like a guy.
Yeah.
If I'm willing to stand literally on
Yes.
the table in front of the GM, this is like a guy that I'm over the moon about, correct?
Absolutely. This is like,
Okay.
Remember when, it's funny, I actually just referenced this player on the running back preview with Charles because we were talking about the 2017 draft class. Remember
so
when
good.
Kyle Shanahan, like that story came out that he's like, if we don't draft this guy, Joe Williams, I'm going to be sick to my stomach.
Yes,
and of
I
course, like
remember
Joe
that.
Williams was one of the many running back picks for San Francisco that they've just lit on fire under the Kyle Shanahan era. So maybe that actually is a poor framing for this statement, but like that's what I'm talking about. Like we need Chris, your draft room, your team needs to get this guy on the field.
Okay, so hopefully this will work out better than the 49ers and their love for Joe Williams in 2017. Mine is Jack Bech, the wide receiver from TCU. I'll start with the comparison, and then you tell me what you think, being the wide receiver guru, and I'm interested to hear how reception perception works out with him. He, to me, is Puka Nacua 2.0. Everything that he does on the field reminds me so much of the Ram star. He's 6'1", 214 pounds. He's not going to win with explosion off the ball or speed downfield. Like, that's not Puka's game either. But in watching him intricately run routes, you see route salesmanship. Like, when he's running a comeback, it's not just running, accelerating upfield and then turning around. He might fake like he's going to run a post and then sit down. When he's running a post corner, there's hip fakes, shoulder fakes. I really love the nuance part of his game where it almost feels like Bech understands, I'm not going to be able to beat this guy with explosion and speed, but with nuance, I can get open. I think his separation ability is pretty good for being 6'1", 215. After that, he is acrobatic catching the football. When it comes to diving for a catch, through traffic, downfield with a safety hitting him from the deep middle, getting his feet inbounds. Like Puka, you're like, oh my God, I don't know how he came down with the football. And Jack Bech did that repeatedly at TCU. When you watch the film, the quarterback play was not very good. He still went over 1,000 yards on about 60 catches last year. And lastly, what is near and dear to my heart, because I think that yards after the catch is increasingly becoming a vital element to playing wide receiver in the NFL. 40 missed tackles forced on 133 catches in college. That is a big time number. And you see it the second he catches that comeback, he cuts against the grain. He has good contact balance. He can make guys miss in space. And Puka, I think, is a pretty underrated yards after the catch wide receiver for being like a possession guy. He's not just consistently falling down on the turf. And the last little nugget that I know you and I from way back, kind of bringing this full circle from our early 2010 days of being draft guys, you like those players that showed out early in their college careers, that had that breakout season when they were like 19 or 20. In 2021 at LSU, on a team with young Malik Neighbors and young Brian Thomas, when Jack Bech was a freshman, he led that team with 43 catches, had nearly 500 yards, 4 or 5 touchdowns. And you watch the LSU film in 21 and you're like, this is a quality player already when he was only 19 years old. He's not one of those 24 or 25-year-old players that stayed in college for 6 years. He's someone that I think is being criminally underrated, probably is going to go on day 2. And I think in 3 or 4 years, we're going to say, why was he not a first-round pick? Jack Bech from TCU. I am not physically doing it right now as we're recording, but in my mind, I am standing on the table saying that whatever team needs just a complete wide receiver, pick Jack Bech.
Yeah, I love a lot of what you said there, including that 2021 LSU note that you mentioned. Yeah, Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors were on that team. So it was like Trey Palmer and Kayshon Boutte. And obviously, like, those guys aren't superstars like Malik Neighbors.
But NFL players,
But they're NFL players, man. And yeah, Jack Bech was the leading receiver on that team from a reception standpoint. I've only just started my work on him. I think I've only done 1 or 2 games in terms of charting him. So I'm very much not full of my evaluation. I didn't go with the Puka comp, but I did note that he's like a super tough player. Like he feels like a Rams receiver because that team in particular, man, I mean, what the Rams ask their receivers to do, it's like it's so singular. Like, I mean, yeah, they have their X's, and I think Devontae Adams is going to be doing a lot of that X receiver stuff, like kind of what they wanted out of Allen Robinson a few years ago. You know, they had Odell Beckham doing this during their Super Bowl run, where they like have a real deal man coverage beating X receiver. The rest of their guys are all like grinders. You know, they're Puka Nacuas, they're Cooper Kupp, they're Robert Woods, like the blocking guys that get in there and specialize in the dirty work. So that was kind of my thought, was like, yeah, that looks like a dirty work Rams receiver to me. I actually kind of thought that, like, I'm a big fan of Emeka Egbuka. I think he's getting a little overthought as a prospect because he doesn't have a, quote, high ceiling. Well, I think you can have a pretty high ceiling if you find yourself in the right offense and you're this big slot type of player. And again, look at Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like, does that guy have a high ceiling if we're lining him up against NFL receivers? Well, his ceiling is one of the most productive freaking receivers in the league. And like, that's kind of how I feel about Emeka Egbuka. And when I started working on Jack Bech, it was like, dude, this guy could be the arbitrage in this year's class, like, of Emeka Egbuka. Like, okay, you don't get this guy early on. You're looking for a tough, dirty work receiver that's maybe 50-50 slot outside. Like, he moves around a little bit, and you use that toughness. That's kind of what I thought about. Like, he could be the arbitrage Emeka Egbuka in this year's class.
Yeah, and when I went with that Puka comp early, it was like, and you certainly know this, and I'm sure like your listeners do too, any of those comparisons, I'm not saying that Jack Bech is going to step in and like Puka had like 30 catches in his first 2 games, whatever it was. But stylistically, records, yeah. Like, I don't necessarily think that, but we have to remember, and that's what I've said. There's one other player that I have a big comp on at the wide receiver spot too. Puka Nacua was a 5th-round pick who did not test particularly well and was reasonably low volume at BYU. Now, his yards per route run was through the roof, and the quarterback play kind of held him back. But that, again, spoke to the comparison even more, that Jack Bech didn't have a NFL caliber quarterback this past season, still caught 60 passes, went, I think, right around 1,100 yards, and was super efficient catching the football in terms of just yards per route run and things like that. So, yes, I view Puka Nacua as one of the top 5 to 7 receivers in the NFL, not because he has a true, to use your phrase, trump card. And I feel like I've kind of stolen that from you. Like, I use that in my scouting reports a lot. I think that's kind of like a old school draftnik or draft Twitter term. Puka just does everything well, and he does the dirty work. He makes those ridiculous catches. He's fights for that extra yardage, and then he breaks free from a tackle and turns an RPO slant into a 20-yard gain. That's the same vibe that I think you will get watching Jack Bech, and that's certainly the one that I got in watching his entire 2024.
Yeah, listen, we need some sleepers in this year's draft class. It's maybe not as sexy up at the top as last year or these last few classes, but it's a group that could have some interesting players on day 2, and I think Jack Bech is a part of that. So love that call out from you, Chris. Anytime we can hype up like a dirty work receiver on this podcast, I am all for that. So I love that you stood on the table, and I think it's going to work out. I think it's going to work out better than the Joe Williams pick for the San Francisco 49ers. Low bar, but I do think we're going to clear that bar with Jack Bech here. Chris, I can't thank you enough for jumping on the show with me today, man. Really appreciate it. I'm so glad we finally got to, 1, meet IRL, and 2, finally do a show together. Tell the people what you're working on besides a bajillion mock drafts, because those will get the clicks anyways. We don't need to hype up the mock drafts. And now that everyone's listening knows that you do them, they're going to go click on them anyways. What are you working on here heading into the NFL draft in April?
A lot of evaluations. So I do the real-time grades for the CBS Sports Draft Tracker after round 1. Pete Prisco's on them on Thursday on April 24th, obviously. But from round 2 until round 7, any grade, if you're using the CBS Sports Draft Tracker, I will be writing the grade, so you can come at me with all the hate that you have, and writing all the evaluations. So I need to have like 300 or so evaluations done. That's really what I'm working on. And then comparisons, bust comparisons, buyer beware article should be coming out soon. I just wrote my 10 favorite prospects, and yes, Jack Bech is in there at CBS Sports. So a lot of evaluations to just get those wrapped up, and I'm really working on the comparisons this year. I'm trying to have a comparison for every prospect that I grade. So, and again, Matt, thanks for having me on. This has been an honor to come on this, talk nitty-gritty, nerdy draft football stuff with you.
Man, Chris is doing the Lord's work over there. Draft grades, mock drafts. He's crushing it here as we're heading into draft season. Can't encourage you all enough to check out his work. And again, thanks to Chris for joining us. That is going to do it for today's show. Tomorrow, we continue our draft coverage with our teams that will shape the draft series as we look at the running back and wide receiver needy teams. I'm calling these like guys that they need a playmaker. I'm looking at the Cowboys. I'm thinking about the Broncos, the Patriots, certainly. We're going to be talking about all of those teams on tomorrow's show. Until then, we are out.